Mind saying your name, what you're studying, what your motivations for taking this class are. We'll start here.
Yeah, my name is Sana.
Sana?
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm in my first year of medical school.
Welcome.
It was my name, why I want to be here, and what year?
Yeah, and your motivations, for being here.
Okay. Just trying to see what the course is about. I think space medicine is really interesting, and I just got connected with Dr. Soles just to see what this is about and potentially, like, I can look into it as a future project or anything like that in the area. But yeah, and apologies, I will be leaving in about half an hour for a class, but I'm excited to see the first half an hour.
Perfect, yeah, and these are recorded, so you'll have
Perfect.
access to them.
So my name is Angela. I'm a fourth year geology student. I joined this course because AI sounds cool, and not a lot of courses at Yale-Berta teach that, so yeah.
And I'm Ryan, also a fourth year. I'm studying physiology, and I took this class because a bunch of people I met just randomly recommended it, and like I've never heard of this class, and I just want to check it out. And
Stuff.
Word of mouth. Perfect. I love it. Okay, so everyone, welcome. You guys have introduced yourselves. I will introduce myself in a slide or two. Today we're going to be talking about space medicine. You're going to be getting a crash course, forgive the term, into space medicine. What the story so far, the challenges of the spaceflight environment, as well as future horizons. So a little bit about me. You're going to learn a lot about what I do through some of the lecture content, but briefly, I am a family physician. 95% of my practice is in rural emergency medicine, and I have an interest in space medicine and extreme environments. I also hold commercial position with a few companies, so I'm the VP of Immersive Medicine with Sonic Technologies. We will learn more about that later this lecture, as well as in the dedicated lecture on virtual and augmented reality. I advise several commercial companies related to space. You'll also hear about that this lecture, as well as lots of other stuff. So there it is. Okay. So what do I hope you get out of this lecture? The hazards of the spaceflight environment, tools for mitigating those hazards, emerging areas of challenges in space medicine, how we practice for space on Earth, as well as emerging technologies, because this is a technology, and the future medicine class. So let's start with a question. Imagine that you are going to the moon today. You are the crew doctor. What are you going to pack with you? Well, in order to know what you're going to pack, you need to know what the spaceflight environment entails. And that includes a whole laundry list of challenges. And some might define it by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I think is familiar to anyone who's taken an introductory psychology class. However, I would argue that in 2023, there's a basic necessity missing from this, and that would of course be Wi-Fi. On a more serious note, in the spaceflight environment, we talk about the challenges of the spaceflight environment. So I said there's a whole laundry list of spaceflight environment challenges. So this includes everything from the acceleration, deceleration, loads of launch and landing. So those are hyper Gs. There's altered day-night cycles. So when we speak about the International Space Station, around 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, the space station orbits at a rate of one sunrise sunset cycle every 90 minutes, 16 sunrise sunset cycles per 24 hours. So you can imagine that if you're sensitive to light, that might alter your day-night cycle and your sleeping rhythm. It's a very operational, very high-paced environment. So astronauts on the ISS are scheduled down to the 5-minute mark. And also you're in a confined, tight space. So you have to play nice with everyone. It's always awkward when you're the astronaut that's voted off the spacecraft. You have to trust the engineering of your environment to protect you from the extremes of the space environment. So from the vacuum of space, from the threat of micrometeoroid orbital debris, from the temperature extremes of the vacuum of space. You have to trust the engineering of your closed loop life support system to keep your environment within the habitable confines of temperature, humidity, pressure. You have to trust the atmospheric scrubbers to clean away noxious toxins from off-gassing from volatile organic compounds, for example. And then there's, of course, there's the daily lumps and bumps you might encounter on day-to-day life on Earth. And all of that so far is ignoring the giant elephant in the room, which would be weightless in space, and that, of course, is weightlessness. Suffice to say that every single bodily system is affected by the spaceflight environment. So our bones lose density at a rate of 1.5% per month without countermeasures. We'll talk about that in a few slides' time. Our muscles lose mass, again, without countermeasures. Every single fluid system in our body is affected. Fluids shift upwards. The moon takes on a puffy, round kind of appearance, which is aptly called the moon face. So this is JAXA, or Japanese Space Exploration Agency astronaut Jackie Mukai. She's a physician and an astronaut, and you can see here the 1G state versus the 0G state. And you can see that her face takes on this rounded, puffy appearance. All the fluids have shifted upwards. So aside from cosmetic effects, astronauts feel like they're congested all the time. As a consequence, they may suffer from congestion headaches, and also they feel like they have a cold. So food doesn't taste as good, it's bland, so that affects the nutrition on station because they may not want to eat. Food has to be spicier, more flavorful, it has to be textured. And you can see here how other bodily fluids are affected. So again, as a part of the consequence of the fluid shift, the cardiovascular system is affected, so fluids shift upwards. The heart becomes smaller and more spherical, and our valves, the valves in our veins, as a consequence, become decompensated. So that means when astronauts come back to Earth, they're deconditioned. And so when you see the astronauts being carried out of a Soyuz capsule, they're covered in garlands, they're being carried out, and it all looks like pomp and circumstance, and part of that is true, but more than that, it's a safety issue, because if these astronauts were to stand up, they would faint because all the fluid would pool to their feet. So that's called orthostatic hypotension. That's not the only fluid state that is affected within our bodies, the central nervous system. So the cerebrospinal fluid, that proteinaceous brain and spine juice that bathes our brains and our spines, also tends to drain in an altered fashion, leading to local pockets of increased pressure. So venous drainage, lymphatic drainage, and CSF drainage is altered in the microgravity environment. As an aside, when I say microgravity, weightlessness, I use those interchangeably. I may slip into 0G, technically not correct, but all talking about weightlessness. So when we talk about fluid shift in the CNS, central nervous space, we end up seeing locally increased pressure at the backs of our eyeballs, where the optic nerve exits our eyes, resulting in increased pressure on that optic nerve. And so you can see here, looking at fundoscopy, the backs of retinas of astronauts on long duration spaceflight, there's a little bit of optic disc edema, so you can see swelling and paleness of that optic nerve. And so that's a consequence of long duration spaceflight for over 30 days, and for reasons we don't fully understand, this actually preferentially affects male astronauts, and in extreme cases causes hyperopia or vision shifts. So, speaking of gender differences, so we talked about males being more susceptible to this spaceflight at an associated neuroocular syndrome. That's that term for that fluid shift. There's other gender-specific differences. So males have a preponderance towards hearing loss. That fainting that we talked about a few slides ago, women are more prone to that. Women are more prone to bladder infections or urinary tract infections by virtue of having a shorter urethra and altered fluid dynamics in 0G. And ultimately, we know that there's no difference between performance and cognition between female-male astronauts. And in fact, the literature shows that mixed gender crews perform better in the 0G environment. So as an aside, so over the years, I get asked for specific topics in space medicine, and I keep adding, so the lecture keeps getting longer and longer. So it's a lot for an hour and 20 minutes. So I've been asked to cover women's health in space, which is a hot topic in space, in my opinion, and in the space medicine communities. So the issue is, why don't we have more data on women's health in space? Well, approximately 600 people have been to space so far. Only 12% of those have been women, and 1% of those have been Black women. So Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space in 1963, and nearly 20 years to the day afterwards, it took the Americans that long to send Sally Ride to space. And of note, what they termed her roommate at the time turned out to, in fact, be her life partner. Sally Ride was also the first gay astronaut, or lesbian astronaut. So there is also a history of needing more diversity in space when it comes to LGBTQ as well, but Sally Ride was the first. So when it comes to menstrual health, basically the strategy right now is most women astronauts tend to use oral contraceptives for period suppression to not have to deal with menstruation in the microgravity environment. It can be messy, it can be inconvenient, but there's also still a lot of knowledge and research that's needed around menstrual health in space. So when Sally Ride first went up, they said, hey, Sally, is 100 tampons enough for a week? And she said, I think you need to recalculate that. And then they, of course, did. So they're actually the initial calculation, 100 to 200 tampons. So again, if you're going through that many tampons in a week, please see a doctor. So the other challenge of why women women identifying astronauts use oral contraceptives or OCPs in space is that the ISS toilet tends to get clogged up with blood because it can't really distinguish between liquid versus solid versus semi-liquid, that is clotted blood. So blood products tend to clog up the ISS toilet, although one might argue why not just engineer a better toilet. However, that's just me. So overall, the data, and we're going to talk a lot more about this at the end of the lecture if there's time. That's one of my areas of research expertise is reproduction and sexuality in the spaceflight environment. So we don't see any true effects in humans for reproduction post-flight, as in astronauts have gone to space, come back and had offspring. There are some confounders. We see women astronauts having more miscarriages. However, they are also older when they tend to start conceiving as well. So there is that confounder. NASA is pretty supportive when it comes to family planning and does allow for cryogenic storage of gametes, so for eggs, for example. Males, for example, have been found to have a sperm decrease in count and quality during spaceflight, but this recovers post-spaceflight. So we talked a little bit about gender differences 2 slides ago. Here's a few more bits of trivia. So men are more prone to re-entry sickness, while women are more prone to spaceflight adaptation syndrome. So this is the system we haven't talked about yet. But the way we coordinate balance and our perception in space on Earth is this careful calibration between what our eyes see, what our proprioceptors and our fingers and our skin tell us about our position in space, and what our inner ears, our vestibular system, detects as up or down or sideways. And the problem is once you get to the microgravity environment, the vestibular system can't tell which way is up or down or sideways. There is no up or down in space. So suddenly there's this mismatch between these 3 systems. And so for the first 24 to 72 hours on station, astronauts may be at risk for being intractably motion sick because of this adaptation to the spaceflight environment. So I'll spare you the mental image of what it's like to throw up in 0G, but for that reason, it's critical, or that no high-risk activities are scheduled in that time frame. So a spacewalk where you might be in a confined spacesuit, again, you don't want to throw up in that environment, but it's also a risk because you may asphyxiate on the particulate matter. Okay, so not to belabor this point, although a design point here, spacewalks, so there are design issues when it comes to design in space, and we're going to talk a lot more about that mid-lecture. So the spacesuits are designed for male proportions, so this can affect joint pressure, joint injuries, how strains and sprains that women astronauts sustain in the spaceflight environment. Okay, here's an extra reading on the topic if you are interested. A couple sessions ago now, we had a dentistry student who specifically requested space dentistry, so this slide is for him. So for example, if we have dental work, NASA wants to know about that. The Canadian Space Agency wants to know about that because there is a potential of crowns, for example, getting dislodged with re-entry and launch. Pressure changes can affect untreated cavities. So I put a few additional links if you're interested. So the surprises keep coming. This is a summary of one of the most comprehensive studies to date. This is the famous NASA twins study. So 2 identical twins, Mark Kelly and Scott Kelly, both Navy pilots, both NASA astronauts. Scott went to space for a year, his twin brother Mark stayed on the Earth, and this was an extraordinarily interdisciplinary study. The scientists look at everything from the gut microbiome to cognition and performance to the molecular level and epigenetics, proteomics, immune system reactivity, and this is a paper from Science 2017, and it's a really good read if you're interested. So they found, for example, there were changes in the gut microbiome, and that could be by virtue of an altered environment, it's a more stressful environment, or just different food in space. But those changes corrected themselves by 6 months post-flight. Vaccines in space. Scott Kelly was the first person to administer a flu shot or any type of vaccine in space, and the idea was to see if he could mount an appropriate immune response, and he did. Cognition and performance. There were some issues with cognitive fog and brain fog, and at one point this was called the spaceflight fog. It was thought that something about the space environment causes astronauts to be foggy. However, when you're up there, it's loud, there's lots of things going on, you're highly scheduled, there's lots of distraction, there's lots of vibration, so that's also now thought to be part of it. And the surprises keep coming. So as recently as 2019, during routine handheld ultrasound experiments of the jugular veins on station, an astronaut was ultrasounding their jugular vein, and then to their shock and surprise, there was a giant blood clot sitting in their jugular vein, which is bad. You don't need medical knowledge to know that. And so now we have to ask, is the spaceflight environment, does that predispose astronauts to the hypercoagulability? So you'll learn this in medical school, where it goes triad, stasis, injury, and epithelial reactivity can all lead to hypercoagulable state, and one might argue that with altered blood flow dynamics in the spaceflight environment, perhaps that may have caused or predisposed that astronaut to a blood clot. This is from a Canadian group in January of last year. So we knew that red blood cell mass was decreased in the spaceflight environment, and part of it was hemodilution, thinking that the red blood cells are diluted, or there's decreased production, but a Canadian group also found that there's increased hemolysis or red blood cell breakdown in the spaceflight environment. So that also contributes to the state that we know as spaceflight anemia. So all of this is to say, this won't be on the test, other than to tell you that simply that space is trying to kill you. And here is a review if you want a good introduction to the topic. But basically that's all you need to remember. And that's just what we know from decades of research in low Earth orbit. So then we need to ask the question, what happens when we go beyond that to the moon, to Mars, beyond? And that's not just a theoretical question, because the world's space agencies are currently planning to send the first woman, first person of color, and next man to the moon starting this decade. Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian astronaut, will be the first Canadian in cislunar orbit. And so the Artemis missions are the international community's plans to send humans to the moon with a view towards establishing the science, exploration, in-situ resource utilization, and permanent surface operations on the moon. So now it kind of becomes apparent that we need to look into this. So when we talk about the big partners in space, once upon a time, way back when humans first started going to space, it was a political showdown. It was the US versus the Soviets. And then as we entered a new era of space exploration, we realized that space is hard. So we should probably approach space exploration with a more collaborative approach. And so then in one of the most collaborative and ambitious feats of exploration, the International Space Station was established by what we then called the Big Five players in space. So that was the European Space Agency, ESA, the Canadian Space Agency, CSA, NASA, JAXA, which is a Japanese space exploration agency, and then Roscosmos, Russia's space agency. So that was the era of the beginning of a new era in space exploration. Today, when you look at the diaspora of what countries have space agencies, it's 96 plus and counting. Bahrain has a space agency, Eritrea has a space agency, Brazil has a space agency. India was the first to land on the south pole of the moon a few weeks ago. So we're going to talk about that in a few slides' time. So the four key partners, for reasons that might be obvious, Russia is no longer part of the Big Five, are planning on putting humanity's first deep space station into orbit around the moon, starting with Lunar Gateway towards the later part of this decade. So this will be smaller than the International Space Station. The objectives will be science, so Earth observation, moon observation, deep space astronomy, sun observation, and of course, serving as a waypoint for the Artemis missions, which we just talked about. And in addition to everything we've talked about with Artemis, the other advantage of sending humans to the moon is serving as a testbed for Mars. So what do we know about humans in deep space so far? This isn't just the world's space agencies planning to go. Commercial sectors, so Elon Musk's SpaceX, Boeing, everyone has their eyes on the moon, Mars, and beyond. Interestingly enough, in geospace politics or space geopolitics, Russia and China currently have a plan to establish a joint lunar base, so we'll see how that turns out. From the medicine side, we know that lunar dust from the Apollo missions was a very potent irritant. So it's fine, it's sticky, it gets everywhere. So it clogged up suit joints, impeding movement. It caused skin irritation, eye irritation, dust irritation, and it's one of the challenges that needs to be mitigated for the Artemis missions. So here's a great article, a summary article from Nature. What's really interesting about this, they do a great job of qualifying lunar dust and talking about follow-up studies, is when they talk about the irritation, the risk isn't as pronounced as it would have once seemed. So the irritation, for example, eye irritation, skin irritation was transient with the Apollo astronauts. The other thing that we need to chat about when we talk about challenges for deep space is radiation. And the summary is the higher up we go, the more we have to contend with. So at least when you're in the confines of the Van Allen belt, so in low Earth orbit, you're still here. So the Van Allen belt, part of our magnetosphere, filters out higher energy ionizing particles from solar particle events or solar flares and background galactic cosmic radiation. So for comparison, all of us here at approximately sea level have exposure to 1 unit of space radiation. The higher you go, the more there is to contend with. So when you're on a commercial transatlantic flight, you have about 40 times the exposure of radiation. And when you're at the level of the International Space Station, you get almost a year's worth of exposure in 1 day. And then by the time you go to a deep space mission, Moon, Mars, or beyond, it's 700-fold what you and I would experience here on Earth, plus its increased energy background radiation. And so the way we qualify radiation risk is there's monthly limits, annual limits, and career limits. And this is gender specific as well as blood organ specific. Or body system specific. So for example, eyes, reproductive organs, especially in women, are more sensitive to radiation. So the career limits for female astronauts are different compared to male astronauts. So you can see here how close we get. So Mir, on the longest mission, 1 year mission, low Earth orbit, got to half a sievert, or just over half a sievert. And when you look at the annual limit for blood-forming organs like your spleen, it was actually exceeded by a little bit. So these are challenges that we have to think about when we're talking about long-duration missions to the moon or Mars. The moon is 2 to 5 days away. Mars is much further. So if you're a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fan, you may know that quote that says space is big, so vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big you wouldn't believe it. And that affects our distances, our travel, and our communications. So I just said it was 2 to 5 days, depending on your trajectory, to get to the moon. Is 6 to 9 months to get to Mars, depending on the alignment of the 2 planets, and that's with today's technologies. So that means in terms of communication delays, it is 2.2 seconds round trip to the moon and 6 to 48 minutes round trip delay communication on Mars. So if you have a calamity that you're not trained for, say there's a cardiac arrest, and it was the doctor that was taken out, you don't have time to radio back to Earth and ask for help. So when we talk about how we approach the challenges of the deep space medicine, we talk about the RIDGE framework, which we've pretty much talked about in bits and pieces, but just to summarize: radiation, isolation and confinement, distance from Earth, altered gravity, and E, which I like to say falls for everything else, but is hostile environments. So that's the altered day-night cycles we talked about, that's the lunar dust, that's the being far away from typical resources. So coming back to our initial question, what do we pack now, knowing, being more familiar with the spaceflight environment, knowing that we're the crew doctor? So we talked about how space is trying to kill us. Let's get a little bit more optimistic now and talk about the resources and tools we have at our disposal. So with space agency level selection, it starts with prevention. You want the healthiest of the healthy candidates to prevent anything from going wrong. And these are strict reasons that people have been disqualified from NASA and CSA selections, include being colorblind. There are height and weight limits. That's more due to the spacecrafts currently being used. Blood pressure limits. People who've had previous herniated discs, because our spines lengthen and shorten in the spaceflight environment, causing back pain. Mango allergies, anecdotally, have been a cause for disqualification because there is known to be cross-reactivity with latex allergies. So probably not going to encounter mangoes up in space, but you might encounter latex through some of the crew supplies. Endocrine disorders, history of psychosis, history of anemia has been a cause of, iron deficiency anemia has been a cause of disqualification in the Canadian selection. So prevention is key, and then included in that rigorous selection, it's physical, physiological, and psychological as well. There's lots of rehab, so there's post-flight, pre-flight, in-flight rehab. We'll talk about what that means in the context of countermeasures, ongoing monitoring, so weekly conferences with the flight surgeon, weekly conferences or bi-weekly or every 2-week conferences with the crew psychologist. There's crew medical officer training, once was about 40 to 60 hours. So there's no doctor at all times on the International Space Station. You can have a crew medical officer with, once upon a time, up to 60 hours of training, more likely now about 15 hours of training. And there's an onboard medical kit with medications, and then you have 24/7 on-call coverage from the flight surgeons on the ground. Also continues on with nutrition, so we talked a little bit about what nutrition demands need to meet, be more flavorful, more textured. They also need to be lightweight, have a long shelf life. They need to be nutritious. So, for example, an orange is a luxury because it is none of those things. It has a poor shelf life, it is heavy, it is wet. So it's considered a luxury. It is brought up for Thanksgiving or Christmas. So here's a snapshot of what crew monitoring and treatment looks like. It's called the CHECS, or Crew Health Care System. So it starts with monitoring or primary prevention. So that's the environmental health system that maintains the cleanliness of the atmosphere. It looks at biomonitoring of the astronauts. There's countermeasures. So this is where we talked about how we prevent muscle mass loss and bone density loss. So astronauts on station have to perform 1 to 2 hours of aerobic and resistive exercise up to 6 days a week to prevent that bone density loss or muscle mass loss. So astronaut Sunita Williams famously ran the Boston Marathon over 4 hours while she was up there. And your fun bit of trivia is that the current treadmill on station is called the Colbert, after comedian Stephen Colbert. Like everything in space, as you'll learn, it is a backronym. So it's the Combined Load-Bearing Ergonomic Resistance Trainer, or the Colbert. And the story goes, Stephen Colbert is such a nerdy space fan that when it came time to vote to name the new American module, NASA put out a public vote. Stephen Colbert overwhelmingly had his fans vote to name the new module the Colbert, and NASA said, well, we can't name an entire ISS module after you. So they compromised and they named the new treadmill after him. So in addition to this pyramid of monitoring, countermeasures, and treatment, When we talk about treatment, there are a series of compartmentalized kits up there, and I'll show you a picture in a few slides of what that looks like. But there's basic life support, advanced life support, there's a crew restraint system, because remember, if you're trying to treat if you're trying to treat a patient in microgravity, it's not very helpful if they float away. Yeah, go ahead.
So when they're running and exercising, there's artificial gravity, right?
No, they're actually tethered down, so you can see up here that they're very much hooked in place to the,
Okay.
yeah, we'll talk about artificial gravity towards the end of the lecture. Kim, how am I doing for time?
Fine. It's 2:34. So
Perfect,
I
okay.
have lots of time.
I'm aware that I keep packing more into this lecture, so I'll just keep an eye on the time. Okay, so yeah, just to be complete here, so there's also respiratory backup, there's a medication kit, there's a procedures kit, there's medical supplies like gauze and the like. Let's talk about the team that supports the astronaut up in space. So, like I said, 24/7 international flight surgeon coverage between Canada, the European Space Agency, NASA, and JAXA. Very, very multidisciplinary. There's psychologists, nutritionists, rehab specialists, physicians. As a physician, you can be a flight surgeon, you can be an aerospace medicine expert, you could be a scientist physician, there's pharmacologists, so it takes a village. We also have, so I know there was some interest in AI and computer modeling, we also have computer models that help us predict, well, what do we take with us? So this is a snapshot of the Integrated Medical Model, or IMM, and basically it helps us calculate what we need and what volume based on different mission parameters. So it starts with the entirety of the medical kits on the International Space Station, and then it says, well, say you're going to an asteroid for 6 to 9 months and you're taking 6 people with you, and your limits of risk for loss of life, loss of mission, loss of crew are this much. And then taking those parameters, it calculates what quantity you need. And you might be saying, well, that's not very useful, because if you end up using the same antibiotics for a skin infection, a urinary tract infection, and a respiratory infection, then that model breaks down, because by the time you've used the antibiotic once, you've depleted that supply. The other part is, well, what medical conditions do we plan for? So the IMM is based off the IMM Top 100. So these are the medical conditions planned for in space. So it includes the everything from the more common things, so the congestion headaches we talked about, CO2 headaches. So remember, in microgravity, there's no convection currents. So when astronauts sleep and they breathe out, CO2 pockets in front of their face, causing vasoconstriction, and they can wake up with headaches. There's more terrifying things like mass trauma, cardiac arrest, and then there's banal but equally terrifying things like diarrhea and zero gravity. So to the point of how singular this IMM is. Oh, and just by the way, the IMM is also informed by a history of what has happened in the spaceflight environment. So luckily, as you'll see from the slides, what happens in spaceflight tends to be the more annoying rather than the life-threatening on a day-to-day basis. So almost close to 50% of astronauts experience the spaceflight adaptation syndrome, where you're intractably sick in space. Your second bit of trivia is that is informally called the Garn scale, after astronaut Jake Garn, who went up there and was intractably ill. He went on to be a US Senator. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if you're a 10, you're a Jake Garn. Coming back to medical issues that happen in space, constipation, digestive system issues, lumps and bumps, so skin, subcutaneous issues, dermatitis, irritation, injuries and trauma, 7% of the time, lumps and bumps. So nothing scary, for the most part, happens here. I have a different version of the slide that shows that cardiac dysrhythmias happen in space. So there have been runs of ventricular tachycardia, which, if you have medical training, sounds scary. However, in these cases, if I saw this in the emergency room, I would be freaking out, because this is a sick patient with ventricular tachycardia. However, in the astronauts in which this has been witnessed on station, the runs of VTAC have been self-limited and asymptomatic. So again, it's the day-to-day annoying stuff, not the life-threatening or scary stuff that happens in space. All right, so the next evolution of the IMM, the more dynamic model of this, allows for us to incorporate different occurrences, whether good or bad, at different mission time points. as well as fixes and countermeasures. So it's a lot more dynamic, which is why we call it the Medical Extendable Dynamic Probability Risk Assessment Tool. Very cumbersome to say, which is why we call it the MedPrat. And this allows us to create several end states. So whether we resupply, whether we use up all our medications, whether we have a broken arm on day 1 of our Mars mission or at the on Mars itself, that all matters. And so the tools that NASA uses to maintain human health in space continues to evolve. The latest is IMPACT, which is Informing Mission Planning by Analysis of Complex Trade Spaces. Don't need to know what that stands for, but basically this looks at stakeholders, subject matter experts, most common, a list of 120 most common medical conditions likely to happen on a cislunar mission, and then looks at what we would need to treat them and how we would address them. So again, the links to all of this are here if you are interested. And then finally, directed aid cyclic graphs. Again, NASA's pretty good about publishing all of its documentation. And this is just a way of having a standard language of looking at all of the possible factors that can affect a condition. So for example, here they look at the risk of a psychiatric disorder on a mission, and they look at what hazards may contribute to it, from radiation to being isolated, how it may affect the mission, what the human level system risk is, as well as contributing factors. So again, just to give you an idea of the tools used to keep humans happy and healthy in space. So we've talked about the hazards of the spaceflight environment, we've talked about the tools at our disposal. The next piece of the puzzle is not just what we will pack, but how we will pack. And we call this the backpacking principle. So if you're an outdoorsy person, you do a lot of hiking, a lot of camping, you're familiar with this concept because you can't bring it all with you. What you bring may be at the expense of something else because you are limited on space or what you can carry on your back. I like to call this the Aladdin principle of space because it is infinite cosmic power to get to space, but itty bitty little space once you get there. So when we talk about how we pack for space, we talk about needing to have technologies that are low cost, low volume, low mass, low power, easy to use, and also have a long shelf life and require low training and are intuitive to use. And so, for example, when we talk about monitoring equipment, portable ultrasound is a great example because it is low volume, low mass, low power. So I'm spending a bit more time on this slide because it often, hint, hint, comes up on the midterm exam. Very often, by which I mean always, and it is most commonly the most poorly done question because everyone forgets about this slide. If you star this slide and memorize it and just address the midterm question with the slide, you will do well. So I'm just saying that more poignantly because I think I need to start saying it more poignantly. Don't be surprised if this is an exam question. Okay, so now we talk about the integration. We've talked about the human level part of the system. So we talked about performance, we've talked about hazards. So we also need to trust the engineering of our spacecraft to work with us. So the human system interface, like the computers that we use, need to be something that the astronaut's familiar with. We need to trust the engineering of the spacecraft to protect us from the spaceflight environment. We need to mitigate the clinical both by prevention as well as treatment. So I really like this diagram. It's borrowed from a previous lecturer I worked with from Embry-Riddle, but it's a great summary of how the human, the spacecraft, and the systems all fit together to create a successful mission and a not just surviving but thriving astronaut. Okay, so then coming back to this idea of packing for space, we talked about being compartmentalized, we talked about being low mass, lightweight. So here are literal photos of what the medical kits look like on the International Space Station. There is a defibrillator up there. Luckily, it has never been needed to have been used. So you can see everything is very compartmentalized, very, very compact. Each medical kit is delineated by, is it used for medication? Is it used for testing? Is it used for procedures? Like here's the airway kit, you can see a stethoscope, a bag valve mask. Is it used for suturing? So there is a suture kit up there as well. Okay, so we kind of talked about the RIDGE framework, but the list of challenges when we talk about long duration spaceflight, exploration class missions, deep space missions, all of those are interchangeable. It is a long list. And so this is a snapshot of the NASA Human Research Roadmap off the Human Research Program or HRP website, and it is a great list because it has all of the risks. It includes everything from what we talked about with radiation exposure to psychological issues like isolation confinement, to the risk of poor interfacing with the computer systems on the spacecraft. So if you're a design engineer, this is a really, there is a need for you in space. To the risk of skills deterioration in the spaceflight environment. And what's really neat about this is it's an interactive list, so I've included the link here. You can actually click on each of these risks, whether it's osteoporosis or decompression sickness, and you can see whether it's been mitigated, how it's been mitigated, or if it's still an active issue. So there's a lot of documentation. Okay, so again, mid-lecture summary, space is hard, space is expensive, space is trying to kill us. So we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about the tools, we've talked about packing for space. So how do we prepare ourselves for space? So what does the International Space Station have in common with a polar Arctic deployment, an underwater research habitat, or a remote village in Kenya? And the answer is that they are all examples of remote, rural, isolated, confined environments. So they all replicate some aspect of the spaceflight environment. And so we call these, they're analogous to the spaceflight environment, so we call them analog environments. So this next part of the lecture, we're going to talk about what we learn from extreme and analogous environments on Earth. This is from my own perspective based on the extreme and analog environments I've been in. So we're going to start with micro and partial, and I should add hypergravity. So we don't need to go to space to replicate zero gravity. You may have heard of parabolic flight, referred to as the vomit comet. So this is just a fancy way of saying that true to its name, the aircraft flies in a parabola, and it's no different than as if you were going over the crest of a roller coaster and your stomach lifts into your chest for a second. It's because you're falling at the same rate as your roller coaster car. Or in an elevator, when you go down, your stomach lifts up for a second because you're falling for a brief second at the same rate as your elevator. And so in parabolic flight, we're doing the same thing. We're following this parabolic trajectory. We accelerate upwards at a 2G pull, and then we fall at the same rate as the aircraft, which affords us a period of about 20 seconds of microgravity. And this allows us to test new technologies, test science, test protocols in the simulated microgravity environment. We don't fly any higher than a commercial transatlantic flight. So we actually fly, when we're flying out of Ottawa, at about 17 to 19,000 feet. A commercial transatlantic flight flies around 39,000 to 40,000 feet. So here we're testing a brand new commercial spacesuit. We want to see how it reacts in microgravity. Can it sleep pressurized? Can it sleep ventilated? What is its range of motion with gross motor movements, fine motor movements? And here's actually, I don't know if this will play. Oh, I guess I'll send out the video later, but there's also a video version of the microgravity flights in the lecture notes. So you might be saying, well, that's 20 seconds. That's not very good, is it? So I'm sorry you're so critical, but also you're right. So there's trade-offs to every analog environment that we operate in. And while we can get good quality microgravity, it is only 20 seconds. So what if you want to test a procedure that takes more time? You can use parabolic flight by breaking up your procedure, or you can use gravity offset. So this is a snapshot from testing we did at the Canadian Space Agency in 2019, and we're testing a totally different kind of spacesuit. So that last one was an IVA, or intervehicular activity spacesuit, one you would use as your second spacecraft if the atmosphere on a spacecraft failed. This is an EVA, or extravehicular activity spacesuit, the kind you would see on spacewalks or that the Apollo astronauts wore. So here, we're inputting a certain amount of weight to allow ourselves to offset our own weight in the system. So here we've offset 99% of my weight. So I'm essentially weightless, and I'm simulating fixing a panel outside the International Space Station. We've also been able to offload our weight by 83%, so to simulate 70% on the moon, 1/6 gravity, or by 62% to simulate 38% gravity on Mars. So the trade-off in this case is whatever's in the harness is subjected to partial or microgravity, the tools in my hand are still subjected to 1G, so the cables aren't going to free float. They're still subjected to the 1G environment. We've only touched on hypergravity briefly, but that is a huge source of potential injury because you're subjected to increased G loads, and they are a very real part of launch and landing. So we simulate hypergravity environments both in parabolic flight. So before we enter into parabolic flight, we're going into a 2G pull, and also in centrifuge. So we were test subjects in a medical study on how people reacted to a flight profile of a suborbital spacecraft. And so at our max pull, we were subjected to a 6G pull in the GX direction or front to back. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but imagine your chest wall is now 6 times heavier. It feels like there's an elephant sitting on your chest, and it actually becomes very hard to breathe. So that's one way that we study hypergravity environments. We also learn a lot about living and working both on top of and under the water. So this is through one of the organizations I mentioned at the beginning that I work with, the International Institute for the Astronautical Sciences. And here we are simulating off-nominal emergency egress operations in an Orion capsule. This is the simulated Orion capsule. It is the capsule that will take humans to the moon and back. So off-nominal is a fancy way of saying crash landing. And we're simulating how we can egress in our spacesuits in case of an off-nominal scenario. So we also learn a lot by working under the water. This is a neutral buoyancy lab. So you may have heard the term before through NASA. NASA at Johnson Space Center in Houston has the world's biggest neutral buoyancy lab, 6.2 million gallons, and has pretty much the entirety of a full-sized mock-up of the International Space Station underwater. If you're a diver, you know with the right buoyancy control, you are weightless. So we talked about the trade-offs with gravity offset and parabolic flight. If you can adjust your buoyancy to be weightless underwater, then you are essentially floating as if you were in a spaceflight environment. So we have our own version of the NBL in Groton, Connecticut through IIAS, and here we're able to simulate an airlock, simulate a panel here in the near field that needs repair and swap out. And so you're working in your astronaut EVA cruise, you're working with topside mission support, and you of course have to latch yourself to every part of the station because if you don't, you'll go flying off into space, and it really does feel like you are in weightlessness. Yeah.
And they have stuff in the water to make it more buoyant, or?
You're adjusting your buoyancy. That's a great question. So we're actually wearing dry suits, and then we're adjusting the air in our dry suit as well as the weights to make sure that we're not too buoyant such that we shoot to the surface of the pool or that we sink to the bottom. So when you have all of that adjusted, you just float in the middle of the pool, and it, having experienced microgravity and parabolic flight, it really feels the same. So
does the water have anything in it, or is it just regular water?
Regular water. Do you have any scuba diving experience at all?
No.
So if you have diving experience, if you ever go for a scuba dive, one of the key things is adjusting your buoyancy so you don't shoot to the top or sink to the bottom. And as a scuba diver, once you're buoyant, you're neutrally buoyant, you actually just float at the level you want. Yeah. So we also learn a lot by living and working under the water as a crew. So I've been lucky enough to do 2 underwater missions as an aquanaut in the Florida Keys. So as you're learning, everything in space and exploration is a acronym, and Neptune is no different. So Neptune was the Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration missions. So we were a crew of 5 over 5 days the first time, 6 days the second time, conducting experiments with respect to technology demonstrations, with respect to physiology, as well as biomedical science. And so this was at an underwater habitat, the Jules Undersea Lodge, 20 feet underwater, so actually not that deep. And this is where a little bit of dive physiology becomes important. So if there were something calamitous like a fire in the hab, we probably would be safe to surface immediately and swim up to the surface, just being at 20 feet. Just 13 miles horizontally, also in the Florida Keys, is the Aquarius Reef Base. And so this is where NASA sends its astronauts to become aquanauts and also learn to live and work as a crew in a tight, confined space. work on those crew dynamics and perform relevant science. And so the difference between these two, and you saw a picture of Aquarius in that introductory slide to this section, is Aquarius is at 60 feet underwater. So once you're underwater for 24 hours, you're in saturation, and all those little nitrogen bubbles that swim around in your bloodstream are in saturation. They're compressed by the pressure. If you ascend too quickly, those bubbles come out of saturation and too quickly and can lodge in bad places like your joints, causing pain, causing bruising, or in extreme cases, lodging in your heart, lungs, brain, causing air embolisms, seizures, coma, or even death. So it's bad. So if you're a diver, you have to ascend at a set rate to be able to let those bubbles come off slowly. At the Aquarius Reef Base, that set rate is 17 hours and 47 minutes. By comparison, when you are at the level of the International Space Station and you have an emergency, you could theoretically evacuate to Earth in as little as 3 to 6 hours. So you can actually get from space to medical care on Earth quicker than you could from the Aquarius Reef Base. So I hope it's becoming apparent what the value of these analogs is for training and learning about space. So just to go back a slide, extreme environments like underwater habitats also let us test technologies that might be used for space or in austere environments. And so I told you earlier that one of my positions is with an immersive reality, virtual reality company called Sonic Technologies. And so my job these days is to help develop clinical, educational, and diagnostic imaging modules, but it all started when we tested the company's virtual reality radiology reading room and a headset underwater, and I was able to link up with the head of medicine or the head of radiology in Saskatchewan to review the imaging of a simulated trauma patient. So that was in 2019, and then in May of this year, we've since developed a mixed reality point of care ultrasound machine that we can again use to create the screen is actually floating above the patient in my headset, and I can also collaborate with remote collaborators to review imaging in real time. So we're going to actually take you through what that looks like in a few slides' time. But the value of this is it allows us to simulate whether these technologies work as expected in isolated and confined and resource-limited environments. Okay, speaking of isolated and confined, there are also actual lunar and Martian analogs out there. So one of those is the Mars Desert Research Station that looks like Tatooine, but it's real life on fake Mars. This is in the middle of the Utah desert. It is a habitat that is meant to simulate a Mars mission. So you go there with your crew for 2 weeks, you bring your science, your objectives, and you live and work as if you were on Mars. So that means if you go outside, you have to suit up, lest the Martian environment kill you. And it really does look like you are on this foreign planet with the vast arrays of red rock. And the views out there truly are stunning. So it really is a lesson in being a good crewmate and crew dynamics. And there's analogs now. So MDRS was the first. I've been there as a crew commander as well as a crew medical officer. And now in this age, I'd say since 2018, new analogs have been popping up all around the world. So there's ones in Poland, off Hawaii, in Chile, where else? In Iceland. And you don't actually have to simulate a whole habitat. One of the interests and key scientific areas of exploration for the moon is, in fact, geology. And so Harrison Schmitt was a geologist on the moon during the Apollo era. There were a lot of lessons learned, and in fact, this is Cinder Lake, Arizona, where NASA actually detonated explosives in this area to create a whole crater-like lunar landscape. So this was our geology class through AAAS in that same simulated lunar landscape. But geology is one of the main areas of focus, especially at the South Pole, especially with upcoming human missions. So the other value of analog environments is as a test bed. So as part of this geology class, we were to take lessons learned from Apollo, what we learned from how these spacesuits impeded their ergonomics. You can see, I wish I included the video, you can see how much the astronauts struggled to walk around. Their center of gravity was too high, they couldn't really bend at the waist, they had to figure out new ways to move around, and then their tools were really hard to grasp with their gloves. And so we took those lessons learned and created new geologic tools. So this may be of interest to Mo's sampling tool. So this is a modified version of Mo's sampling tool. Instead of having individual picks, my creation was to put 4 of them on one block, so you wouldn't have to keep swapping them out when you have so little range of motion in your hands, and then create a stick so you're able to operate it without needing to be up close to your lunar geologic sampler. Since you're a geologist, I'll actually harp on this a bit. Other of my colleagues, they had, again, extended handle sledgehammers, again, just for ease of use for ergonomics. We had seismic sensors. One of my colleagues from Portugal had created the seismic sensor. One had a really cool built-in chair that just allowed you to lean back so you could kind of survey your environment without having the suit, fighting the suit. All right, operational environments. So you don't need to go out to the middle of nowhere. You don't need to simulate the moon to be able to simulate some aspect of the space flight environment. Operational environment. So any environment in which a lot is changing and you need to be aware of changing inputs both in the environment as well as within yourself and your team to be able to adapt and perform. So flight is one of those. This is a high altitude noctilucent cloud campaign we performed in high level Alberta in 2017. So it is 19,000 feet, unpressurized research craft. That's why we have the oxygen on us, and it's a very tight space. You have the research pilot, you have the mission specialist who keeps us on course, and then you have myself as the payload specialist testing this brand new tomography instrument, hoping to get some imagery of these clouds thought to be related to climate change. So that also helps us with crew dynamics. And then, again, you can sometimes create your own resource-limited environments. You don't have to go out to the middle of nowhere. This is a snapshot from my space medicine class. And basically, we take our students out to the wilderness and take away their resources and teach them to become a medical MacGyver. And there's more research coming up around analog environments and how we create standards for safety, healthcare, as well as protocols and guidelines. So I'm just going to pause here. Are there any questions before we move into the last section of this lecture? No? Okay. All right. So bringing this all together now, we've talked about the challenges of the spaceflight environment. We talked about preparing for space. We've talked about tools. What is the gold standard? What are we working towards when we talk about astronaut health? Well, the standard would be ideally to provide the same level of healthcare as we do on Earth, as we do on space. But this is a class about technology and the future of medicine. So why don't we be a bit more ambitious and say, what if we didn't just meet the standard of care on Mars as we see on Earth, but what if we surpass that? So how do we do that? What about using emerging technologies? So to that I say, why don't we borrow ideas from science fiction? So we talked about the 6 to 9 month journey to Mars. We talked about the risk of fluid shifts and bone density loss and muscle mass loss. So why not just teleport there? Why not take away that 6 to 9 month transit time? We talked about the risks of the microgravity environment, so why don't we just create our own gravity, like in Space Odyssey 2001 with a rotating space station? What if the astronauts who were decompensated once they get to Mars could suddenly use an exoskeleton to be able to provide them with external support to do heavy lifting so they can get to work right away? What if we could upload skills? Remember we talked about skills deterioration being a real risk for long duration missions. So what if we could upload skills to our brains just like in the Matrix? Or what if we just said that's all too much work? Why don't we just send avatars of ourselves to Mars? So the future is closer than you think. So for example, so coming back to the virtual reality radiology reading room that we've created, inside a headset, VR and AR is actually being used. So virtual reality and augmented reality has already been used on station. It's been used for just-in-time training for operations. And in fact, we're doing a lot of work both in space and in remote communities here in Canada. So I'm actually going to skip these lectures because we're going to spend more time on them in the virtual reality lecture. But this is actually what I see when I'm in my headset. So the entire radiology workflow that a radiologist would have with their high resolution monitors, the space that they need to set all that up, we've recreated in virtual reality with all of the tools that you would need to read your images. So that's what I mean when I say a digital twin of a radiology reading room. So again, I'll save the video for a few lectures from now, if this will let me. There we go. Okay. And then again, speaking to the point of the risk of skills deterioration, the other thing we do is we create education, training, and certification modules in virtual reality, both for astronauts on long duration missions, as well as for healthcare professionals on Earth. So this is a snapshot for one of the modules that we've created for the Canadian Space Agency for medical evaluation on the moon. But we've also tested our software in zero gravity. That's one of my colleagues, Heidi, testing our software. And we'll go more into that into the VR lecture. So has anyone here seen the movie Gattaca? No, you guys are too young. So this is a movie about 1996, I think, Uma Thurman, Ethan Hawke, about genetically enhancing humans, giving them extrasensory skills or extra abilities and powers. And the future is closer than you think. So this is an article from the 2017 MIT Technology Review called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. And in this, they make the argument saying, if you are sending astronauts to a high radiation environment, it's not unethical to genetically enhance them, to protect them against this environment. And in fact, it's probably unethical if you don't genetically enhance them, knowing that you're sending them into this high-risk environment. So they talk about ongoing research and posit splicing elephant genes with human genes, not to create like an elephant-human astronaut hybrid, but because elephants rarely get cancer because they have so many copies of onco-editing genes, so cancer-editing genes. And so the ongoing research at that time started with splicing banana genes, but the idea is borrowing genes from animal models to help make your astronauts more resistant against a high-risk environment. And in fact, the future is closer than we think, because in 2020, the Rodent Research 19 project sent genetically engineered mice up to space. And so you can see the mutant mouse here with the ACVR2 neuromuscular blockade, as well as the not subjective little mouse there. And with this neuromuscular blockade, these mice were less susceptible to muscle mass loss and bone density breakdown, and they found this in both the flown mice and grounded mice, and in some cases even gained muscle mass. So NASA is literally engineering Mighty Mouse, and then the Earth application simply is that understanding how these neuromuscular blockades work can also inform our understanding of neuromuscular and degenerative diseases here on Earth, such as Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So genes, this is just a slide to say that gene synthesis and editing is, again, one of the precision medicine techniques that we're looking at to keep astronauts healthy in space, point-of-care diagnostics, portable devices, genome-guided therapy and medicine. This is kind of a summary slide from the few slides before. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, I know you have dedicated lectures on this, but in the context of spaceflight, again, borrowing from science fiction, we don't want a HAL 9000. We want, the idea isn't to replace the astronaut or replace the human, but to help guide our medical decision making. In medicine, our job is not to know everything or to get it right all the time, but it's to know where to look up answers and also to use the tools available at our disposal. And machine learning is one of those that can help guide diagnosis. So for example, if there's a constellation of symptoms that fits into, is this a pneumonia, is this a viral illness, how can machine learning help us guide our clinical decision making as well as treatment? 3D printing, additive manufacturing is also a future-looking technology that can currently exist today that will help us with long-duration missions. So in 2009, Made in Space became the first 3D printer on station. They were able to print small parts of tools. And now NASA is looking at 3D printing pieces of meniscal knee cartilage. So if you have a knee injury, perhaps you can use that 3D printed cartilage up in space to help stimulate recovery. All right, artificial gravity. So it sounds like science fiction. Space Odyssey 2001 kind of built on the concept of O'Neill's cylinders, but this is actually simple physics. We create artificial gravity by the rate of rotation squared, so v squared over our radius. So in fact, as a disclosure, I advise a company, Above Space Development Corporation, that is creating the world's first commercial artificial gravity space station, or as you might see in the media, space hotels. So there's actually a lot of research around it. Again, here's a good Nature article on challenges and what we know about the story so far in artificial gravity. And then if you're really interested, I've just put down some of the areas where we need more research due to the side effects of microgravity. Human hibernation. Again, the future is closer than we think. So in 2019, the European Space Agency ran a computer model of how we could save on resources for long duration missions to Mars. And they posited that if you had your astronauts hibernate or sleep for most of the 6 to 9 month journey to Mars, waking your astronauts up 3 weeks before they stepped foot on the red planet, you could actually minimize the volume of your spacecraft by 30% and ostensibly save on the consumables that you use. And so to translate into real world application, the Alaska Biology Institute is working on research to induce hibernation into non-hibernating species. So the ground squirrel hibernates. It reduces its metabolism by 99%, so it uses way less resources when it's hibernating. That would be great for long duration missions. So to start, they started trying to induce hibernation in rats, which don't hibernate. And they managed to get the rats to hibernate with side effects of decreased perfusion to the gut, leading to perforation, sepsis, and death. So they still have some things to sort out, but people are working on it. And you might be saying, well, why don't you just build a faster rocket? So people are working on that too. This is a concept for the Basmir plasma engine. So instead of a 6 to 9 month journey to Mars, this rocket would get humans there in 39 days, mitigating the risk for all those countermeasures, because long duration spaceflight effects tend to come in around 30 days and higher. Yes, go ahead.
Just on the last slide.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between induced hibernation and a coma?
So a coma is more of a pathological state. Coma is when something has gone wrong. Usually there's something metabolic, there's a trauma. It's not a natural state for humans. If you see a human in a coma, it's they're very sick and you cannot predictably wake them up. So hibernation is a natural physiological adaptation. It's not when you're sick, but if you're an animal that hibernates, it's how you survive the winter. So that would be the key difference. And so when we see coma patients in the intensive care unit, they need a lot of care. In addition to nutrition, fluids, they need to be turned every 2 to 4 hours so they don't get pressure ulcers. So when we sleep, you're like, well, that's a coma, isn't it? Well, you're actually making micro movements in your sleep. When you're comatose, you're not. So you actually are very susceptible to risk from breakdown ulcers on pressure points. So the back of your head, your bum, your ankles, and if those aren't treated, you can erode all the way down to the bone, and those can get infected and even kill the patient.
So theoretically, in hibernation, the person would still move?
There's probably still micro movements, yeah. Yeah, or if you induced hibernation in a human and there aren't micro movements, you would have to create a system for rotating a human or having them in suspended animation. And now we're really getting to the sci-fi territory. But it's a problem that needs to be solved, so it's worth looking into. All right. So the summary is, in order to be able to successfully send humans to Mars and beyond, we're going to have to science the space out of this with a little bit of MacGyvering as well. So in the last 8 minutes here, what is next in space medicine? What problems do we have to solve and what else is on the horizon? So we've talked about the gravity problem. Now we need to know what the gravity prescription is, because we have all this data. We have 4.7 billion years of evolution saying 1G does great for all of us, whether we're talking about amoebas or humans. We have 60 years of human spaceflight data that says there are a lot of adaptations that happen to human in space, not all of them good. But we don't know about 17% gravity on the moon. We don't know about 38% gravity on Mars. If 17% gravity on the moon is enough, then that means that's very promising for Mars, because that means that we don't have to deal with muscle mass loss, bone density loss. But we don't know how much gravity, for what time periods, at what intervals we need to keep humans surviving and thriving in space. So that's why we say, what is the gravity prescription? We also need to think about the psychological profile of a crew on Mars. So we've talked about the profile a little bit about screening when it comes to being an astronaut for a low Earth orbit mission, for a 30-day mission to the moon. But if you're spending 6 months to get to Mars, you probably don't want to just stay there for 2 weeks. Some mission profiles are of 3 to 5 years. So what kind of person thrives in that environment? And just how self-sufficient do they need to be? So one of my other areas of study is psychological resilience in long-duration spaceflight. And so there is actually research that says that resilience is a learned trait, and it comes down to, there's different models out there, but we can learn about resilience by breaking things down, rather than thinking of one monumental task, engaging positive self-talk, telling ourselves that we can solve this, having positive social support networks, whether it's our team or a crew up in space or back on Earth, impulse control, resisting the urge to give up, and mental rehearsal, preparing ourselves for the best, worst, and most likely case scenarios. There's also research around coping in austere environments, and it's very similar to the research around resilience. So there's breaking things down, positive social support networks, enduring harsh conditions, which I translate as impulse control, emphasizing the positive, there's that positive self-talk, and then also realizing that you can't control everything, relying on luck. So if you're interested, I can certainly send you the book chapter. I always like to ask, well, what if we made spaceflight a little less austere? The more I get into exploration, the more austere environments I go to, the more I realize that we're part of a system with our environment. We need plants, and I would also posit we need animals to survive. So if I could have a pet on the moon or Mars, I definitely would. And it's not something that's often talked about, but the reason that our austere environments are so austere is because they're resource limited. They're animal scarce. They're plant scarce. We resupply is at a premium. Space is at a premium. So how do we work with that to bring some of our Earth systems with us? What's happening here? I think some slides aren't showing up.
Huh.
Okay, well, that's fine. Pretend those slides are interesting. Okay, so we talked about what kind of profile of astronaut crew we would send to Mars. The other question is, how self-sufficient do they need to be? This is Leonid Rogozov, who was a Soviet physician on an Antarctic deployment in 1961. He felt right lower quadrant pain for a few days. He thought, I'm going to just walk it off. That didn't work. He developed a fever. He thought, I'm going to take some antibiotics. That didn't work, and before long he realized it was his appendix, and he had two choices. He could let his appendix burst and he could die, or he could take out his own appendix, and that's exactly what he did. Now imagine having to do that on Mars. We don't want to. So there's actually an argument out there in the space medicine community, and here's a great 2012 paper to that effect, saying that maybe we should just have astronauts take out their appendices before we send them to space. And if that seems extreme, there's actually precedent out there. So this is the Chilean settlement of Villa Las Estrellas on King George Island outside of Antarctica. And the rule is if you are over the age of 6, because you are so far from definitive medical care, it's over 600 miles, you need to have your appendix taken out to live there. So if it's good enough for Antarctica, it's good enough for Mars. Okay, so other questions as we get to the end here. We need to ask, well, we see all these sci-fi concepts of above ground habitats in our depictions, but there are many out there who think that there's so much radiation. The safest way to have humans live off on the moon and Mars is by living under meters of regolith or under all of that terrain to filter out the radiation to prevent radiation injuries. We talked about the food problem, having food with long shelf life, that's nutritious, flavorful, textured. So one of the space food companies I advise has done exactly that. They made a nootropic chocolate that is made for space, so it has a long shelf life, has most of your recommended daily intake of vitamins. It has nootropics to help focus and cognitive performance, and my favorite version of this product is caffeinated, so performance for space and Earth. So I'm just going to go through a few more slides before we call it a day. As the nature of our space missions change, we also need to think about how the medicine needs to evolve as well. So our spacewalks are no longer floating outside the space station, outside of rocky, traumatic terrain. On the moon, we'll be working on dusty, very slippery, high grade, high slope terrain with lots of rocks. So there is a high risk of trauma and injuring yourself. So our medical capabilities need to evolve alongside that. So imagine you have a downed astronaut on a spacewalk, and you don't have the capability to haul them over to the rover. This is a concept from the European Space Agency called the LISA, or the Lunar Evacuation System Assembly, and this is them testing it at NEMO, that aquarium underwater research habitat we explored earlier. And basically you're able to transport a downed astronaut in this type of stretcher meant for navigating over lunar terrain. We also need to think about what models we use to inform our medical infrastructures. So what of the austere environments in which we've sent humans to, what can we use to inform our medical capabilities on the moon? Whether it's lessons learned from the International Space Station, lessons learned from a refugee camp, or lessons learned from medical deployments. This is my vision of how I see us building permanent off-world medical capabilities. So this includes starting with what we have in terms of crew medical officer training, medical kit contents, first aid triage, basic and advanced life support on the International Space Station, building towards basic field hospital and surgical suite, adding intensive care capabilities. And then if we're really meaning to send humans off-world for long duration, then we also need to think about primary care. We need to think about how do we maintain screening maneuvers for diabetes, for high blood pressure, for pap smears, for example. And then how do we build up the training and personnel and the image capability and supporting technologies to support that. So I see we're at time. I don't want to go over. So I'm going to turn it over for a couple of minutes of questions. There is a lot more here, but it's probably because I love space medicine so much and keep adding about 10 slides every year. But the stuff you need to know that will be on the exam has already been covered. Any questions at all? Yes?
What would we need to know specifically aside from that one slide? Because that's a lot of information.
Yeah, so we're still doing open book exams, yeah? Yeah, okay. So I don't want you to memorize everything. I believe that you are smart, and I believe that you have the capability to inflict great good on the world. That is my premise for every student who comes through this class. So I want to see that you've learned how to think, create, synthesize, and think critically. So your exams are open book. I want you to take the knowledge that you've learned, and then I ask you questions that are more creative and synthesis-based. I will always tell you what I'm grading on, what the point breakdown is, and what you are able to match those up. And it's basically on your ability to think critically and creatively. So the students who've figured out they can match them up, they get 90 to 100%. I've had a few 100% before. People get 90 to 95% on my section, speaking about my section specifically. And then the folks who, once in a while, we get folks who don't read that part of the question and they miss out on those points. And you'll see whenever I grade, I'll give you, if you lose a point, you're going to know exactly why. So it's not about memorization, it's about synthesis. Questions? All right, we'll see you next time.
Great.